Following up on what she read and studied, what was her formal education, and was she a student of history or a student of government or a student of economics? I mean, formally or informally?
So she was actually a history major in college, if I can say that's anachronism, and believe it or not, she got her degree from Leningrad State University. So you can imagine what she learned there, which was the communist version of history, which she did her best to resist. And I think from college, a lot of what she took was that any idea could be said to have political meaning. So any piece of art, any piece of culture could be categorized as counter-revolutionary or revolutionary. So that was a style of thinking that she learned there. Prior to university, she had a very good education, or up until the coming of the Bolsheviks. She went to a gymnasium for, well-educated children. She read several different languages. Her parents wouldn't let her read Russian literature. They insisted she only read French literature. So she was very educated and very cultured, but she did not have a lot of formal schooling. And she read a lot coming to the United States as she was learning English. And she read a lot in the 40s. She did a lot of reading of Aristotle. She was developing Atlas Shrugged. But by the 50s, she was reading very little. And this is something that everyone who knew her personally comments upon. She was a very slow reader, and she had this system of thought that really enabled her to fit new information into it. So she didn't seek out a lot of new information. And one of the sort of tragedies of the story, as I tell it, is that over the course of her life, as she became more and more famous and prominent, she was surrounded by fewer and fewer peers. And she really was surrounded by students who were younger than her and who looked to her for intellectual guidance. So in the early part of her career, she was arguing with equals. She was really fencing with others, figuring out her ideas, defending them. By the early 50s, she's no longer doing that, and she's never being questioned, and so you see sort of an ossification or hardening of her thought at that point on.
These are excellent questions, and it's exactly the sort of dialogue we like to encourage. And let me specifically invite some of the students who are here to join in the conversation. Us oldsters shouldn't be the ones who are monopolizing all of the question time. So let me invite any of the students who have questions to, as they used to say, come on down.
Well, we're lifetime students, George. So. From your study of Ayn Rand and her effect on American life, is it reasonable to assume that her philosophy has so morphed into a libertarianism that rejects all forms of government, just about all forms of government, and thereby made certain that the libertarians will never win enough adherents to really matter in American politics? Are they going to remain marginalized?
I actually am fascinated by this very question. Sort of libertarianism and its fates preoccupy me in my intellectual life and a bit in the book. So Rand was not an anarchist, and she really staked herself out. The anarchism became this vogue in the student right in the late 60s. You may not know this, but it was the hottest new thing among young conservatives was to become an anarchist or an anarcho-capitalist, to distinguish you are a right anarchist, not a left anarchist. And Rand really said, that's absurd. We need to have a state. It just needs to be very limited. Rand's influence on the libertarian movement, has it limited libertarianism's success? Definitely. And you see over the course of the 70s a sort of moving away from the deep inspiration of Rand to a willingness to blend other approaches, and also to move away from her insistence on principle, that principle must come before all else. Now, that's not a very good way to go far in politics, right? To be principled and uncompromising. And there's this real moment when the Cato Institute, which is the first organized arm of libertarianism, moves from San Francisco to Washington. And it's seen by many of his adherents as this terrible sellout. They're going to Washington. Of course, that was a great move for Cato to become more influential. I think we're in a bit of a libertarian moment right now, but What I prefer to think about is a libertarian sensibility rather than a libertarian ideology. So by sensibility, I mean I'm talking about the sort of undecided, the new independents, our fastest growing category, that they remain attuned to certain libertarian messages about fiscal spending, government regulation, how government activity can hurt small businesses. So they're sensitive to these issues. I don't think they're buying the whole libertarian package. I think that we may see a new synthesis in the future if politicians can figure out how to speak to these sensibilities without buying the whole libertarian line, because I think American voters have shown again and again we like having a pretty big state and we like it doing a lot of stuff for us. We just also like getting angry at it simultaneously. So I don't know how to finesse, who will figure out how to finesse that. But I do think you're seeing it with the Tea Parties and everything like that. There is this sense that we're spending too much money, we're not being careful with how we use government, and I think that opens some opportunities for a diluted, watered-down libertarian discourse.
Well, I find it really interesting how you talk about the various resurgences of RAND, especially talking about during the Johnson era, which was followed by a great resurgence of the Republican Party and growth, especially in the South. And I was interested in what you thought how you thought Rand played a part in that resurgence, and where she will play a part, I guess, bouncing off of that in the Republican Party with her current resurgence.
So in the 60s, a lot of people, Atlas Shrugged was kind of like a sleeper cell of a book, published in 1957, and it became really popular in the 60s when people looked at Johnson's Great Society and said, this is this altruistic rhetoric that's just creating a big, messy state that's going to really create problems. So she definitely became popular then. She was a real inspiration for a lot of people involved in Barry Goldwater's 1964 campaign. She actually urged readers of her newsletter to go register Republican and vote in the Republican primary. She wrote a speech for Goldwater. She sent to his campaign. He never used it. And she, much like Wilkie, she was besotted by Goldwater in the primaries. And as he neared the national election and sort of tacked to the center, she decided he was compromising his principles. So Goldwater is the easiest place to see this activism happening. It's more diffuse in the years after Goldwater, and then it comes together with the draft. And here you see left and right sort of joining together in opposition to the policies of the Johnson administration and the Vietnam War. As for today, that I think is still in flux, what role she's going to play. It does seem like today's conservatives are much more comfortable with her atheism than they were in the 1950s. And there's much more a sense that Ayn Rand has something to contribute. We don't swallow her whole, but let's take what's useful. She's energizing the base a lot right now. Whether that's good or bad for the Republican Party is something I think we're all kind of waiting to find out. So it may be a bad sign, it may be a good sign. I'm not sure how it's going to play out, but she's definitely getting people up on the barricades. So that has consequence.
Hi. To what extent, through your research, did you find that some of her most emotional excesses could possibly be attributed to what Nathaniel Branden talked about, how a lot of women during the 1950s, to control their weight, got prescribed amphetamines, and we know that Rand took them, her doctor prescribed them, and so some of the sort of more paranoid or unreasonable anger that she sometimes expressed, Branden in his writing talked about he thought that had something to do with some of the medication she was taking. Did you get any sense through your research to what extent that was true, or if it got worse as she got older, or how that might have impacted her relationships and things of that nature? Yeah,
so she was definitely taking amphetamines, which were prescribed to her when she was first finishing The Fountainhead. And she was very open about this. She wrote to all her friends and told her, I've got this great new drug, I can stay up and write for days at a time. And her friends told her to stop taking it. And I have several letters, they said, stop taking that. And then in the archive, I was able to look at just binders and binders of photographs of her. And there's this moment in the 1940s, it's about the mid-40s, when I suddenly looked at her and she had lost an enormous amount of weight and she was rail thin. And I was like, wow, she really was taking amphetamines, because she's sort of more of a stout-bodied woman, and in this, few years, she's just rail thin. So, and then there's plenty of evidence that she continued them throughout her life. I'm not a medical doctor. I don't know how this would have affected her. I think there's a good case that it pushed her along trajectory she was already going on. She wasn't a mild-mannered, warm person to begin with who was radically transformed by this usage. But, she had a quick temper. She was a bit paranoid. She had kind of a germ phobia as a young woman. So all these things just got intensified. I think there's definitely something to that. On the other hand, we should keep in mind that it was really common for writers of her. There was Benzedrine had this cult following among writers. Jack Kerouac wrote all of On the Road on Benzedrine in 3 weeks or something. So this was very much part of the literary culture, and I think only now do we understand, yes, it can have very negative consequences. So I tend to think that's a big part of the story of this hardening that I talk about, this loss of outside influences, the need for control. I think that definitely played a role.
I've got a question about Rand's view of evolution. Clearly she was a believer in social Darwinism, but did she see herself as part of any larger collective whatsoever, and therefore needing to have at least a limited altruism towards those closest to her to ensure not only their survival but actually hers in a selfish way?
So I think Rand saw herself as she saw herself as a producer and a creator. And so to the extent that she sort of divided the world into people who produce and create and people who don't, who are the moochers or the looters, who would ride on the others, she did see herself as part of this broader grouping of people. But the point about those grouping of people was they can do it all themselves. They don't need any help. They don't want any help. And that if you help them, you would only help them because you valued them or because you were trading something for them. So she did not really engage with biology at all. She didn't have a theory of origins. She was an atheist and was convinced that there was an objective reality that we could know and understand, had no spiritual side. But she didn't really wrestle with this question of origins. It wasn't of interest to her. I think whatever she picked up of Darwin was via Nietzsche. I found no evidence that she read him or really grappled with that at all. So it's an interesting contradiction that she was very rational but not very interested in science per se.
As a young conservative, I was kind of told to read Goldwater, Buckley, Reagan, or the Founding Fathers. Why is it that Rand is occasionally forgotten to be mentioned? Her newsletters are those open to the public. Why is it that she is seemingly forgotten amongst people who are trying to learn about the conservative movement throughout history?
So I think there's two reasons. One is this issue of her atheism, that there's been a sort of consensus that religious values and religious belief is essential to conservatism. It's not a side issue, it's built into the very structure. And that was Buckley's real ability to build religious belief and link it to capitalist thought that had previously been pretty secular. So Rand threatens that synthesis. So any pointing to Rand will threaten that synthesis. I think that may be changing a little bit today. The other thing is this morality of selfishness, this transvaluation of values she promotes, that you should be concerned only with yourself. It's very different than a lot of conservative thinking, which looks at society as sort of an organic whole where there's reciprocal roles and obligations. If you look at traditions of English conservatism or Edmund Burke, it's very much about the integration of society and the obligations we have to other people within the society and keeping order. Whereas Rand was like, I'm a radical for capitalism. Everything we have is wrong. Let's, blow up the building, burn it down, start again. So I think conservatives are uneasy still with her presence for what she says about religion, and there's some anarchic, rebellious energy still in there that it may be felt is not the right thing for people to be reading. But I would be interested if the next generation in your place is finding Rand right on that top 10 hits list.